Keynes's entire theory of the interest rate is especially perverse because Keynes views the interest rate as a phenomenon determined in the short run by the supply of money and the demand for money. And this is a very grave theoretical error. The supply of and demand for money determine the market price of the monetary unit, that is, its purchasing power. The interest rate is the price of present goods in terms of future goods. Well, Keynes insists that the interest rate is determined by the supply of money and the demand for money. Of course, this appears to make sense. He wants spending. He wants credit expansion, a reduction in the interest rate. The way to immediately lower the interest rate is to inject credit expansion. This pushes down the interest rate charged, and economic agents are more likely to ask for loans, to accept the newly created loans. So, Keynes holds that the interest rate is determined by the supply of and demand for money. He calls the demand for money the liquidity preference. And if he is asked what the liquidity preference is and what determines the liquidity preference, he answers, the demand for money or the liquidity preference is determined by the interest rate. So, which is it? You say the interest rate is determined by the supply of and demand for money, which is the liquidity preference. And when people ask you what determines the demand for money or the liquidity preference, you answer the interest rate. This is simply circular reasoning that explains nothing, and it rests on a fundamental theoretical error, confusing the price of money, which is its purchasing power, with the interest rate, which is the price of present goods in terms of future goods. As I have said, the bad guy throughout the Keynesian analysis is hoarding. In other words, not spending. Therefore, what we must do is spend, either on investment or consumption. Furthermore, I have already explained to you why the paradox of thrift is false. Why did Keynes fail to grasp what we have discussed in class? Well, basically because he did not read Baverk's book, and therefore he lacked a theory of capital. He never understood how an increase in saving, which has a negative impact on consumption, since people consume less and thus prices fall, unleashes a series of microeconomic forces that invariably cause a tendency towards the lengthening of the capital structure, which becomes more capital-intensive and hence more productive. This capital structure absorbs workers and productive resources that were employed close to consumption, and it takes them to the stages furthest from consumption. Once the structure has been lengthened in a sustainable way, it matures and provides a much larger flow of consumer goods, and these are of higher quality. As a result, all workers' standard of living improves, while nominal wages remain the same or similar. Keynes never understood that money can be made even when sales do not rise. For profit, dear students, and this is obvious, everyone knows it, is the result of a subtraction. That is, income minus costs. And if your income does not rise, or it falls, you can still make money if you reduce costs. And where does one reduce costs? At the margin, by replacing labor with capital equipment. So, workers are laid off in the stages close to consumption. And where do these workers go? They go to produce capital equipment, tractors, computers, etc. Precisely the capital equipment needed to replace workers. Keynes never understood this, because, and I repeat, as astonishing as it seems, Keynes did not spend too much time in economics classrooms, as you are doing, nor did he study capital theory or know much about economic thought. He was a very arrogant person who thought he knew everything and could assimilate anything. Worst of all, Keynes's entire theory ultimately boils down to one thing: deceiving workers by lowering their real wages through inflation. As you know, the immediate cause of unemployment is that wages are too high and labor markets are rigid, but the mediate or indirect cause is the credit expansion, which leads workers to take jobs in the wrong places. When the market uncovers this situation, productive factors must be transferred on a massive scale from places they do not belong, unviable lines of production, to places they do. We are in this phase now. This is what the recession consists of. When the labor market is very flexible, the transfer takes place quickly. When it is rigid, a high volume of unemployment persists for a very long time, which is happening in Spain. One way to solve this problem is to deceive workers, and this was done in Spain before the country adopted the euro, when we still used the peseta. What was done? What measure was taken in the previous crisis when Solchaga was finance minister? The peseta was devalued 3 times. Overnight, 20% of all the wealth and income of Spanish people was expropriated from them, and the next day, people were unfazed, thinking nothing had happened. Inflation was at 20%. Interest rates were at 15%. It was a mess. Now, with the euro, which acts as a very imperfect proxy for the gold standard, we can no longer do this, and therefore, luckily, we are feeling the full force of the terrible consequences of prior recklessness. We are facing the bull, and we have no choice but to take it by the horns and accept the discipline required to carry out the reorganization and the necessary structural reforms, labor market reform, austerity in the public sector, etc. For the first time, politicians stand naked and powerless before the citizens. There is nothing politicians can do. They cannot use Keynesian policies to manipulate and deceive people. For in the end, what does Keynes's policy consist of? Injecting money into the economy by way of public spending, fiscal and monetary policies, so that the depreciation of the purchasing power of the monetary unit creates a money illusion. Workers' real wages drop, and unemployment is absorbed, since workers' standard of living falls. Workers are not obliged to accept labor liberalization reforms or decreases in their nominal wages, but they watch as the prices of the items they buy rise much faster than their wages do. Did Keynes think workers were idiots and were not going to notice this? They do end up noticing it, and they ask for pay raises, which at least compensate for the decrease in the purchasing power of the monetary unit. So the Keynesian medicine ultimately cures nothing, and it involves a huge cost, because injections of money through credit expansion and public spending distort the productive structure, lead to systematic investment errors, and draw productive factors to areas where they should not be. Keynes's much-vaunted general theory was never a general theory. Keynes titled the book The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, but it certainly does not contain a theory, much less a general one. It contains a trick to deceive workers in a specific historical context, like in Greece a few years back, when everyone is protesting and the desperate assessment is made that no structural reforms are possible and that the only way to avoid a revolution is to devalue the monetary unit, allow prices to rise, and expropriate workers' income without their realizing it. In other words, at best, it is a particular theory that is applicable only in the most severe stages of an economic recession. And take note, there is no scientific basis for the theory, and it is applied at enormous cost, because monetary injections do not produce aggregate effects like those reflected in the equation of exchange. It is not simply that the general price level rises. On the contrary, money is never equally distributed among all citizens, as in a helicopter drop. Instead, some receive it initially, others receive it later. The structure of production is distorted, and malinvestments are made. Furthermore, the problem becomes much more serious. Though all the resources that have been poorly invested will have created work in the short run, it is not sustainable, and an imbalance immediately arises. The new lines of production are discovered to be unviable, and workers must again be moved somewhere else. The cure is worse than the disease.